Hello and welcome to Lesson 5, Factors Affecting Obedience. So today's lesson we're going to look at some of the factors that influence obedience rates, such as proximity, location and uniform. We're going to talk about dispositional explanations as well. Remember, disposition is to do with personality, and the main one you need to know is the authoritarian personality, though we're going to talk a bit about education as well. Let's have a look at cross-cultural variation then. One way that obedience varies is across cultures. If you have a look at the stats down here, these were Milgram-style experiments that were carried out in different cultural contexts. As you can see, the US males generate this standard 65%. The UK, slightly lower at the time at 50%. You could argue that after the war, the USA obviously underwent the Red Scare, McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy was telling people that there were commies hiding under their beds. So the general state of fear by the time Milgram's carrying out his research is probably a bit higher in the USA, and that could have contributed to the difference. Australia, why might they be slightly more rebellious and less likely to just obey blindly? Well, Australia was originally a penal colony, so it could be argued that the reason why people are slightly more disobedient is because actually they have some genetic trait or cultural trait as a result of originating as offenders. Germany, the highest level at 85%, and that reflects German culture even after the war. So what were the variations? Obviously we've got Milgram's original study. We see 65% give that 450 volt shock. However, in a slightly modified version, he takes his experiment to a rundown office block instead of the original sort of prestigious Yale University. Milgram started to think that, well, maybe the location matters. So when he takes it down to a rundown office block, out of the 40, only 19 obey. So we see an obedience drop. Learner's presence in the room. So in one variation, the learner was physically present in the room. So the participant could actually see the consequences of his action. The subject was told to hold the learner's hand down. And surprisingly, although it's a drop, still 30% obedience rate, which is quite high to physically force someone's hand onto an electric plate and look them in the eye while you're doing it. Variations of Milgram continue. We've got when the experimenter was not in the room, look, obedience drops substantially. And this is because as soon as the experimenter leaves, the direct pressure that's being levelled against the participant disappears as well. Even when orders were given over the telephone. Increase the number of teachers. Now this is fascinating. This in some ways is the most fascinating. When you had two other teachers in the room who were both obeying, obedience rates rocketed to 90%. But when those teachers dropped out, or one of them dropped out, obedience rates dropped to 10%. I mean, this is incredible. How weak-willed are we as human beings that we require just one other person to lead the way, and only 10% will give that lethal 450 volts. When experimenters conflicted and they were arguing with each other with contrary instructions, obedience rates dropped to 0. So all these variations show that obedience has many factors, situational and, as we'll see, dispositional. So, why do we obey? According to Milgram, one of the reasons why we obey is the agentic shift. Agentic just means agent. Agency. Agency is being in charge of your own actions. So he suggests that obedience occurs when an individual shifts from an autonomous state, acting on own demands and responsibilities, to an agentic state. And that's where we act as though we are an agent of someone else, carrying out someone else's wishes or orders. And that very much means that we feel like that person is responsible. If I send you to collect, a laptop from a room in the main corridor, and you go and do that, and then Miss Dixon reports her laptop as stolen, and I deny it, the first thing you're going to do is say, he made me do it. And that's the agentic state. You're not taking full responsibility of your actions. This was most powerfully seen in the Nuremberg trials, where the common defense was, I was only obeying orders, in a thick German accent, obviously. Okay, so another explanation is that in Milgram's original study, the person giving the orders was perceived to be a legitimate authority figure. He was a researcher wearing a lab coat, and he told the participants that they were helping carry out research into learning, and that this would have benefits to science. Another one, this not mentioned in the spec, but it's very interesting, is graduate commitment. What would have happened, do you think, if the participants had entered the room and the first shock that they were able to give or instructed to give was a lethal 450 volt shock? Very few people would do it. In fact, if you look at crime, for example, crime follows graduate commitment. Very few people start off with their first criminal act being, armed bank robbery. It's usually petty theft, graffiti, actually arson is quite common, even amongst murderers. So graduate commitment is you start off slow, in this case, and small, 15 volts, working your way up, and it's a foot in the door approach. The role of buffers. So the role of buffers are really important. Is there a buffer between you and the consequences of your action? Right? Think about, for example, firing a missile compared to shooting someone directly. Think about how impersonal drones are at the attack. And it's much easier to fly a drone and press a button and kill 100 people than it is to actually do that face to face. Learner's presence in the room then. Evidence of this comes from this variation. The learner was physically present and they had to hold their hand down. Obedience rates dropped when there were no buffers between the learner and teacher. Justifying obedience. So remember, the initial justification was that science wanted to help people improve their memory. So there was an overall good. And participants may have justified their taking part in this with that in mind. When they later tried to stop, they were told the experiment requires you continue. By offering an ideology it's good for science, people appear more willing to surrender their freedom of action in the belief that they're doing some overall good. During the Holocaust, the Nazi propaganda portrayed the Jews as a genuine danger to civilization and German culture. And this created a justified or a just obedience. Dispositional factors. So those are the situational factors and explanations for why we obey. Here are some dispositional factors. The main one is the authoritarian personality. So Adorno in 1950 claimed a particular personality type, and this personality type is more likely to obey. They have traits such as status orientated, so they're very concerned about what your status is. Conventional and conformist, they are suspicious and hostile, and they see the world in black and white in terms of good and evil, right and wrong. So, the authoritarian personality, this was based on Freud's idea that the adult personality is determined in childhood. And really this comes from parenting style. So the parenting style is an authoritarian parenting style that is harsh, punitive, with little love and much punishment. This develops fear of parents, and that can result in people being excessively respectful of authority figures and highly compliant. Or it can lead to hatred of parents, which can lead to hate, anger, and we displace that hate onto others. Alright, so the authoritarian personality has a relationship between low education, high F score, likely to have higher obedience. But Hyman and Sheetsley say that education is a more important factor than just the F score. Criticisms, though, of the dispositional explanation is that Milgram actually in his own study showed how powerful these situational variables were. Milgram argued that authoritarian personality could not explain the findings, and therefore disposition cannot explain obedience alone. However, with that, it's worth noting that 35% of participants did not obey, and that can't be down to situational factors. That is likely dispositional. Middendorf and Malone, 1990, found that education is a moderating factor, with less educated people being more authoritarian than the well-educated. This could provide an alternative explanation. However, when education levels were controlled for by Elms and Milgram, they still found that the more obedient subjects were more authoritarian, suggesting that it is authoritarianism that causes obedience. So that's the content, a nice speedy one for you. Obviously there's more in the guide notes as always. I've got a couple of questions I'd like you to have a look at and bring them with you next lesson, and we'll go through some with some excellent model answers. Show. Let's start. First one's an AO2 question. Using your knowledge of authoritarian personality, answer the following. Sarah and Haley are very different characters. One night, they watch a film. It is about the trial of a police officer who has been physically abusive to prisoners, supposedly in his care. As the judge was about to give the verdict, Sarah said, "The prosecution have a good case against him. I think he's guilty." Haley replied, "How can he be guilty? He was just doing what he'd been told." With this in mind, how might the fact that Sarah and Haley are very different characters explain their differences of opinion? This should be a tricky question, but think about what you know about dispositional explanations and how this might feed in to the differences between the two. Alright, second question then. Complete these PEE points. So I've developed 2 PEE points. The first one, I've completed the point view, I've input the evidence. All you have to do is fill out the explanation. And then here, the point's done, the explanation is done, but I'm missing some evidence in the middle. Complete those 3, write the whole thing out by hand, and input the missing parts, and bring it with you next time. So, that is everything. Thank you very much for your time. And I'll see you.